Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here and welcome to the final lecture of the CEDLA Public Lecture Series of the academic year 23-24, but also the very last CEDLA Public Lecture hosted here in room 202 of the Kaiser Frontino building, because we are going to be moving this summer to the inner city campus. So it's also a goodbye to to this location, and upstairs to the library where we'll be having drinks afterwards. So you're very welcome to join us. It's our pleasure to host Kate Saunders-Hastings and her talk on criminal displacement, rupture, and reckoning in extortion economies in Guatemala. Kate is a lecturer in Latin American studies at the University College London. And she is also a participant on the ESRC project on anthropologies of extortion. And aside from that, her focus is on urban and political anthropology. So we're going to be hearing a very close to the ground ethnographic account of what extortion and displacement looks like in Guatemala. And we have the pleasure to have Katherine over from who's an associate professor in conflict studies from Utrecht University. And he's also the coordinator of the master program in conflict studies and human rights. So thank you so much. And he also has extensive field experience in Central America, not Guatemala, but El Salvador a lot, and works on similar dynamics. So it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Julian, for the introduction and for the opportunity to be here today. And thanks to all of you for coming along on this beautiful Friday afternoon. I'm sure there are more attractive locations to be in Amsterdam, and particularly thank you to Chris. I really look forward to the discussion that's going to follow on from this talk. Because what I'm hoping to do in this talk is to sort of bring together two strands of my research on the gang territories of Guatemala City. So on the first hand, a long-standing interest in the development of extortion economies and their impact on everyday life and security, which has been a focus of my research for more than a dozen years now, and which I most recently was kind of pursuing and following up with 2 months of field work that I just returned from a couple of weeks ago. And then alongside that, a kind of new and emerging project on the dynamics of forced migration occasioned by gangs in Northern Central America and Guatemala in particular, or what I'm calling criminal displacement. And part of this also is emerging from the project that Julienne mentioned, this European Research Council project on anthropologies of extortion. And with this, we're a team of close to 20 now, each working in a different country, Latin America, East Asia, South Asia, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and Western and Southern Africa, kind of trying to think about both transnational patterns of similarity and variation in kind of criminal extortion and extortion as a mode of sociality, but also thinking about kind of transnational connections and transnational dynamics that arise out of extortion. And so that's also kind of where these new thoughts about forced displacement and migration are coming in. There you go. So to start out here with extortion. Extortion is a billion-dollar industry in Central America's northern triangle of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. It's been perhaps the most robust of growth industries there over the past decade, spilling over from the territories of street gangs called maras to permeate virtually every sphere of economic and social activity. A report compiled by the organization Global Financial Integrity in 2022 estimated that across Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador each year, 330,000 people are victims of extortion, and that Northern Triangle extortionists reap well over $1 billion from individuals and businesses, with El Salvador yielding the highest sums, at least before Bukele's crackdown on gangs there, and Guatemala having the highest numbers and rates of cases. Across the Northern Triangle, extortion is predominantly, though not at all exclusively, an urban phenomenon. In Guatemala, it's most concentrated in these southern and eastern districts, the most industrialized and urbanized parts of the country, and particularly in the metropolitan region of Guatemala City, where the 2019 reported extortion rate of 334 per 100,000 people was over 5 times the national average rate. Roughly half of all reported extortions in the country are registered in the Department of Guatemala, which comprises the capital and its satellite cities and suburbs. So I want to kind of signal a caveat here, though. It's very difficult to get any accurate sense of the true dimensions of the region's extortion economy. Any figures and statistics should be seen as partial and really quite unreliable, as it's always necessary to factor in what's called in these countries the estadística gris, right? That hidden number, likely a large majority, who do not report their victimization by extortionists out of either fear of reprisals or a sense of futility that the authorities either can't or won't do anything about it. One 2014 survey of businesses in El Salvador found that 84% of those who had received extortion demands did not report them to the authorities. And Guatemalan experts and police detectives I spoke with this spring estimated that at least 65 to 80% of extortions there are currently going unreported. Nevertheless, what the figures we have on extortion do suggest is a striking trend of spiraling growth. The sharp upwards trajectory in reported extortions during the 2010s is seen on this graph here on the left. And I think this trend here in extortion might go a long way towards explaining why, despite the murder rate halving over the last 10 years from its peak around 2009-2010, Guatemalans have been consistently reporting rising perceptions of insecurity, a sense that they feel more, not less, in danger year on year, despite those homicide rates coming down. And indeed, as homicide rates have declined significantly across the Northern Triangle in recent years, extortion has to some extent replaced violence at the heart of the public imagination of and everyday talk about the paradigmatic wrongs inflicted by gangs and their members on the good citizens of these nations. One NGO worker I spoke with last month, who runs a rehabilitation program for women ex-convicts, spoke to this shift. She complained that the employers she works with to find former prisoners jobs on their release categorically refused to place anyone convicted of a crime related to extortion, telling her, quote, "I would rather she had killed than extorted." And extortion also features prominently in the security platform of President Bernardo Arevo, who took office at the beginning of this year. Less than a month after his inauguration, in a heavily publicized ceremony on the Constitutional Plaza at the heart of Guatemala City, he launched a new police task force, the Special Group Against Extortion, with great fanfare and a promise to be an implacable enemy of the hated extortionists. Of course, the war on gangs and extortion has been taken rather further in neighboring El Salvador, to the envy of many Guatemalans I encountered on my most recent trip. But since that's very much Chris's wheelhouse, perhaps we can talk about some of the interesting dynamics emerging from El Salvador in the discussion. Now, alongside extortion, a second and internationally more prominent story out of the Northern Triangle's past decade has been that of migration. So during the 2010s, global attention was particularly drawn at moments of the crisis of unaccompanied minors at the southern border of the United States from 2013, 2014 onwards, as well as around 2018 with the so-called migrant caravans causing political furor as they made their way from Northern Central America through Mexico towards the US. Notably, the biggest surge in Northern Central American international migration came not in the peak years of gang violence statistics, but at that point when murder rates were beginning to fall and extortion figures were starting to explode. As extortion economies took root and expanded throughout the territories of these states, many felt their prospects for refuge from gang demands and threats within their home country was shrinking. Extortion had become, in the words of one displaced Guatemalan I met, like a really bad cancer that had metastasized throughout the body politic. In the United States, Mexico, Southern Central America, and further afield, there are now hundreds of thousands of Guatemalans, Hondurans, and Salvadorans claiming asylum, often on the basis of threats, extortion, or persecution by the Northern Triangle's maras, and the inability or unwillingness of their home states to protect them. Citizens of these three countries make up the largest segment of asylum seekers by nationality in the United States. And yet, along with those from Mexico and Haiti, applicants from the three northern Central American countries are also the least likely to be granted asylum in the United States, with success rates of just 15 to 20% compared to nearly 75% for citizens of the most successful countries and an average global success rate of 35 to 40%. So why is this? There are, of course, multiple factors that contribute to differential success rates. But one important issue for many Northern Triangle asylum claimants has been the nature of the threat they are seeking refuge from. As has become apparent, immigration lawyers and migrant advocates, as well as academics serving as expert witnesses in Central American asylum claims, as I've done on a number of occasions, criminal displacement and gang-fueled persecution do not fit very easily into extant international protection regimes. And so at the top of this slide is the definition of refugee from the first chapter of both the 1951 UN Refugee Convention and its 1967 protocol. These are the foundational texts of modern international refugee law and the basis of the definition of refugee in the national legislation of most states. And the definition is practically identical between those two texts, which is why I've listed them both. The only difference is that the original convention specified that the persecution had to have occurred before 1951 in Europe. And so the 1967 protocol was just recognizing the reality that many states had already acknowledged within their domestic practice, that in fact, refugees could come from anywhere, and that unfortunately, political and other forms of persecution did not end after World War II. But what I've highlighted here are three aspects of this definition that represent the most common stumbling blocks for gang-based asylum claims. The first is the question of what constitutes persecution. Is being threatened or targeted by a gang persecutory in a way that a general climate of insecurity or high levels of criminality is not? It has in many cases been hard to get judges and tribunals abroad to accept that the gangs of the Northern Triangle have both the capacity and the willingness to persecute individuals throughout their home country, rather than just within the neighborhoods that these people originally resided in. The second and perhaps the most common obstacle is proving the claimant's persecution arises from one of the available protected grounds. Most gang-based asylum claims use the vaguest of these grounds that are listed, that being membership in what is called a particular social group. The vagueness of that category is both a help and a hindrance here. It's usually the only or most plausible option in cases of criminal displacement to get that claim into the courts, to make an argument that this falls under the international protection regime we do have for asylum claimants. But on the other hand, there's a wide degree of subjective interpretations available here. Do victims of gang threats or extortion constitute such a particular social group? On the basis of what characteristics might we say that they do so? So the bar for qualifying as a particular social group or a member thereof varies significantly by country, and is often particularly hard to meet in the United States, where jurisprudence in many of the immigration court circuits has held that membership of a particular social group needs to be based on what they call immutable characteristics. We can sort of delve into the details of this after, but essentially there's been a move towards trying to narrow the available range of social groups that might fall under that category. And so the fact that this is much higher than general international standards in the United States is clearly a problem, given that this is still where most Central American asylum seekers are aiming to lodge their claims for refugee status. And then finally, there's the issue of what protection is available to the claimant in their country of origin. So what is the threshold for what would count as effective or good enough protection by a home state? And what's a sufficient reason for being unwilling to avail yourself of it? This is something we particularly come up against, again, in US immigration courts. Judges there have frequently questioned why there are no police reports to support claims of gang victimization, and they seem to have difficulty understanding why people in these particularly marginalized urban neighborhoods might not wish to involve themselves with often highly corrupt and abusive security forces. But there is, though, a nascent body of humanitarian policy, jurisprudence, and scholarship emerging at this nexus of forced displacement and organized crime. And Latin America has been very much at the forefront of this emerging field. The 1984 Cartagena Declaration on Refugees sets out non-binding standards for the protection of asylum seekers in the Latin American and Caribbean region, which has since been incorporated into the laws or immigration practice of 14 states. It adopts a definition of refugee that is notably broader than that in both the UN conventions and US law. In particular, through its inclusion of those phrases, generalized violence and seriously disturbed public order as sufficient basis for seeking asylum, and the exclusion of any language referring to the home state's capacity or willingness to protect. Were this alternative definition to be implemented more widely, it would open more straightforward paths to protection for migrants displaced by criminal threats and violence. However, the first application of this particular definition came fully 35 years after the promulgation of the Cartagena Declaration, when Brazil invoked it in 2019 to justify expediting the asylum claims of Venezuelans on the basis of the evident threat to security occasioned by that country's seriously disturbed public order. It's largely in the last decade that the issue of forced criminal displacement has been integrated into international policy instruments. In 2010, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees issued its first ever guidelines recognizing the role of organized crime in forced migration, which it has notably extended in its region-specific published views and guidance notes for Central America and Mexico in 2016, 2018, and most recently in 2022. In this last document, which was addressed specifically to the US government and seeking to kind of close some of those gaps in the legal practice there, the UNHCR sought to define what they call gang resistors, a category under which they include those who refuse or fail to pay extortion demands as a particular social group under the Refugee Convention and Protocol, as well as to establish extortion as sufficient persecutory grounds for a claim. Because this is still quite recent guidance, it remains to be seen what, if any, impact these efforts may have on the jurisprudence of US immigration courts and decision makers in other countries hosting Northern Triangle asylum seekers. But I also want to highlight that transnational migration, though by far the most visible, is not the only or even probably the most common form of criminal displacement. In my experience, most people threatened by the gang will go to great lengths to find a way to stay in their home communities or to relocate in less risky and less resource-intensive ways. It's very common to encounter stories of multiple displacements as well. The first within the country to try to rebuild a home, reopen a business, and a second internationally when yet another threat or extortion demand arrives and people despair of their options inside Guatemala. There are hundreds of thousands of people displaced within the borders of Northern Triangle countries. Crime and gangs are not the only causes of international displacement or international migration here. The climate crisis and natural disasters have had an intense impact, especially in Guatemala's more indigenous northern and western regions. But they are the prime driver of internal displacement in the more urbanized south and east, as well as in neighboring countries. In one survey of internally displaced Hondurans, the top 5 reasons given for leaving their homes all related to gang activity. And I would point out that although extortion is 4th on this list, it's really not possible to kind of separate it from that overarching category of threat that's way out in front. Because after all, people don't leave because the gang asks them for money. They leave because the gang threatens to kill them or their children if they don't pay that money. So those kind of collapse together. Now, there really are no good figures on how many Guatemalans might fall within this IDP category, as the Guatemalan government has declined to recognize the existence of internally displaced persons there. I've listed this figure of 242,000 IDPs in Guatemala from the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center because it's the only one we have, but I really don't think it's particularly useful at all, as it's based on very old data and estimates that came out in the wake of the 1996 peace accords and peace process that ended Guatemala's internal conflict. Efforts to estimate the size of internally displaced populations are also further complicated by the fact that most people hiding from these gangs within their home countries, which have networks across the national territory, are very anxious not to be found, not to be identified as displaced, or to make themselves known and visible to authorities. But available if patchy data from Honduras and El Salvador have recorded rates of internal displacement on par with those typically reported in active war zones. In Guatemala City's Mara territories, internal gang displacement most often leads to an urban to rural movement, typically a return to those rural districts which individuals, their parents or grandparents left for the city, and where they may retain some social and kinship ties. But in addition to city to countryside movements that do sometimes track when people move across departmental borders in Guatemala, the least visible, most poorly documented, and likely by far most common form of criminal displacement here sees people shifting from one neighborhood to another around the fringes of Guatemala City's peripheral and precarious districts. I have many dozens of stories and mentions of forced displacement from my research site collected in my field notes over the years, and the large majority of them record movements of this last type within the city's so-called red zones. So thus far, I've been trying to kind of sketch out these issues in a fairly broad national and regional perspective. And in the rest of this presentation, I want to start kind of delving into that detail, to explore the evolution of Mara extortion in a longitudinal perspective, and to try to start tracing several strands of this relationship between gang-run extortion economies in Guatemala and this emerging concept of criminal displacement, though now from an ethnographic rather than a legal or humanitarian perspective. And in doing this, I'm drawing on ethnographic research in gang territories in Guatemala City, where I've been conducting fieldwork since 2011. Most recently, over the past 2 months, as I mentioned, primarily in a place pictured here that I call Colonia El Romero, a poor and notoriously violent neighborhood in the northeastern sector of Guatemala City. Colonia Romero is a compact concrete peninsula that juts out and down into the steep ravines that define Guatemala City's topography. The neighborhood is a mix of planned public housing lots and informal settlements, and it's home to an extremely dense population of perhaps 20,000 people, most of them very poor and very few of them employed in the formal economy. It sits in Zone 18, which is one of the most violent of Guatemala City's 22 subdivisions. During the main stretches of my fieldwork, this one zone of one city accounted for roughly 1 in 10 murders in the entire country. It's paradigmatically associated with gangs, violence, and extortion in the public imagination, and is often said by both residents and outsiders alike to be one of the reddest of Guatemala's so-called red zones, as the statistical and discursive epicenters of gang activity are called here. My research in this part of Guatemala City spans a period during which the systematic gang extortion of residents went from a dismaying relative novelty, engendering high levels of violence, to a resented but widely anticipated everyday eventuality. The Mara Salvatrucha and Barrio 18, which now dominate the gangs of Central America's Northern Triangle, appeared in Guatemala's capital and other Central American cities in the early to mid-1990s. Hybridizing an imported Californian gang culture with existing local forms and traditions of street gangs. For a whole host of reasons related to the end of Guatemala's internal conflict, the rise of drug trafficking through the Central American Isthmus, and the state's mano dura and mass incarceration-based response to these street gangs, Guatemalan Maras were starting to become markedly more violent and more entrepreneurial about a decade after their appearance. From 2002, El Romero's numerous cliques fought each other in what locals call the War of the Maras, which ended in 2008 when one Barrio 18 clique exterminated their last rivals. The entire neighborhood has since been under their control, and they operate a criminal economy centered on the extortion of households, stores, markets, services, and transportation in their territory. Every kind of economic activity within El Romero falls within its purview. No enterprise is too small to escape notice. During my fieldwork, daily rates ranged from 10 to 15 quetzales, so that's about €1 to €1.50 for ambulant vendors and tortillerías, to 30 quetzales or 3 to 4 euros for market stalls, 50 quetzales for stores, and rose according to the business's perceived earning potential. This clique has long been among the capital's most powerful gang factions, and they also claim the right to extract extortion from several other nearby barrios. Transportation is perhaps the largest source of extortion income for gangs here. Buses passing El Romero pay roughly 10% of what they would expect to take in. With scores of drivers on this heavily trafficked route along the main road, which is the main highway that leads out towards the Atlantic coast, that tithe could easily give the clique a monthly return in the realm of $50,000 US from buses alone. And larger corporations operating in their sector are also subject to extortion demands, as evidenced by a bomb planted by the gang in 2018 at a Coca-Cola plant in the neighboring industrial district. Although bigger businesses rarely denounce extortion demands to authorities, because, as one local reporter told me, they prefer to just pay. They calculate it as a cost of doing business. And while extortion is at the heart of the gang's economic activity, it's not their only enterprise. Like other cliques around the capital, El Romero's manages the drug trade through and within their community, retailing mostly marijuana and crack cocaine or piedra from abandoned homes and empty lots around the barrio. The gang and their associates, typically female partners or relatives, also run apparently legitimate small businesses in the neighborhood, corner stores, repair shops, things like that, including a number that had been abandoned by their original owners due to extortion demands. Abandoned houses of the kind that you see here were a very common sight during my first 2 years of intensive fieldwork in El Romero from 2011 to 2013. In the years following its introduction, extortion devastated the neighborhood's economic and social capital. Many fled the matters exacting demands, harsh discipline, and exemplary terror. A 2011 survey by the local Catholic parish estimated a more than 20% drop in El Romero's population. The following year, I found that in some of the worst hit sectors of the barrio, 1/3 of homes had been abandoned. One of the many days that I followed Doña Ana, which is the name I give to one of my key informants, on her duties as president of her neighborhood committee, the displacement caused by the establishment of the Mara's extortion economy was starkly evident. Going door to door to see where to direct the attentions of an anti-dengue public health team, we found empty lots on nearly every block. Where grass was already growing through the floor, that's where they killed the whole family for failing to pay an extortion, Anna tells me. Further on, where an acrid garbage burn was smoldering, that's where that little girl was raped not long ago. No use, a neighbor tells us as we knock on one door. They all left after their son was shot on the bus last month. Down the staircase and into the next alley, our knocks go unanswered again. The gang wanted their boy, you see, had to go, of course. These sad and dangerous places became artifacts of both personal and collective loss, littering the neighborhoods like ancient ruins, as one older woman described them. The shells of houses were particularly expressive of tragedy for barrio residents because the idea of a home here is so charged with pride and desire. In this largely self-built neighborhood, houses are often constructed and improved over decades of the family's incremental saving and investments. Homes in El Romero are tangible evidence of security, dignity, and hard-won achievement. This was clearly the case for Doña Ana, who had first staked a claim to her lot with a bundle of tarps and metal sheeting. This is no champa or shack anymore, she would often say, looking around the dwelling that she'd saved and borrowed for over more than 15 years until she felt she had a suitable home for her 9 children. Now it's a house. One man described to me the home he had built over 17 years and in which 4 of his 5 children had been born. A beautiful house, all blocks with a second level, windows, and a lovely floor. But his was one of the empty ones. The gang had offered his teenage son the choice between joining up, paying an impossibly large sum to avoid recruitment, and execution. So a family of 7 left their beautiful house with its lovely floors for 2 rented rooms in a distant suburb. And this was the eventual fate of Doña Ana's house too. She and her younger children were forced by gang threats to return to the rural village in eastern Guatemala that she had left as a teenager, fleeing from a violent husband. One of her daughters later joined the more visible and documentable flow of international displacement as an asylum claimant in Spain, after she was suspected of speaking to the police as a witness in a gang murder, and clique members sprayed her home with gunfire and threatened her toddler's life. Romero's abandoned homes were the material manifestation of a social rupture. In the first several years of my research there, talk about extortion tended to occur in registers of shock, loss, and nostalgia. It often revolved around the idea of broken codes and violated norms that these quotations all speak to, with informants citing the rupture of so-called códigos de barrio as the crux of what had gone wrong for them and their neighborhood. The gang's predatory turn to rapacious extraction in their neighborhood, that point when they traded the code of the barrio for the ideology of a business, as one ex-gang member put it to me, occasioned for many of my interlocutors something akin to the cognitive and emotional dissonance of what Anthony Giddens calls ontological insecurity. If ontological security in his definition rests on certain social, emotional, and behavioral formulae that sustain trust and the predictability and solidity of everyday life, then ontological insecurity arises when our practical and moral maps prove inadequate to orient and guide us. But on more recent visits to El Romero, people had begun to speak of the gang and its extortion in tones that were less distressed and more resigned. While violence and displacement continue, catch-up conversations with key informants still tend to start with a recap of who has been forced out or killed since my last visit, people no longer seem to feel disoriented. New rules and patterns, those mental and behavioral formulae on which ontological security rests, have emerged over a decade of systematic extortion. Extortion and the violence that still accompanies it were anticipated, expected, predictable, a budgetable expense, as one of the quotes on this slide suggests. Where gang extortion demands were once typically presented as exceptional one-off payments, most cliques have now transitioned to a model of regular payments. Anytime a new business opens within a gang's territory, heavily armed representatives of the clique are likely to appear soon after. They'll demand an extravagantly high sum, which the business owner will counter, opening a negotiation to arrive at a figure for both a substantial startup payment to the gang and a weekly tithe to be delivered thereafter. When the Bono 14 and the Aguinaldo, the biannual bonus salaries received by all Guatemalan employees, are paid out, the gang gets an extra extortion quota too, so they also get 14 monthly salaries. And if the government announces a one-time cash payment to citizens, such as a bono escolar or a school supply bonus at the start of the school year, the gang demands their cut of that too. And perhaps this routinization and institutionalization of payments is contributing to a mental shift that one detective described to me as a transition from victimhood to clientship. While payments demanded by and given to the gang were previously almost always described by residents as extortion, extorsión, by 2017, they were starting to use euphemisms such as renta, impuesto, rent, or tax that I once had only heard from gang members themselves to kind of describe and include the violence behind their extraction. Some people have even begun referring to it as seguridad, security, that same term used for the quotas paid to private security companies that patrol the gated neighborhoods inhabited by middle and upper class Guatemalans. The more legitimate tributaries to gang revenue streams have also been gained in employments. The clique has taken over an ever greater number of businesses and homes in their territory, and they're running or subcontracting the running of these as shopkeepers and landlords. Abandoned homes are typically no longer looted for parts or left in decay as they once were. Instead, they're appropriated by the gang and either offered to collaborators or rented out for profit. So for an increasing number of barrio residents, paying them out a renta is now a factual rather than a euphemistic description of their transactions with the gang. And with this, El Romero's clique is participating in what appears to be a regional trend of Northern Central American maras diversifying their portfolios beyond illicit enterprises into a host of industries, notably including full or part ownership of real estate, transport, and retail businesses. The cash-intensive businesses that populate poorer neighborhoods and popular markets in the region's cities allow gangs to launder money as well as to make it. And this diversification also grows the gang's social power in urban communities by making them employers, business partners, and landlords to growing numbers of people. And I'd like to take a moment here to consider some of the factors that I think have facilitated and fueled this consolidation of gang extortion economies over the past decade. With an estimated 80 to 90% of all extortions in Guatemala coordinated from its prisons, the penal system is indisputably the hub of this booming criminal economy. They've got them set up like call centers, one government advisor on the prison system told me. Crowded to nearly 400% their official capacity, Guatemala's prisons are desperately overcrowded, overpopulated, and under-controlled, at least by the state. They're often very tightly controlled indeed by powerful prisoner bosses. The combination of the consolidation of MATA command structures within prisons and the easy flow of information, intelligence, and orders between streets and jails has facilitated the corporatization of gang extortion and its extension over the national territory of Guatemala. However, another, and I think perhaps underappreciated outcome of shifting the MATA's center of gravity into the prison system has been on the level of group culture, in the ways that it's redrawn the spatial and social relations of gangs and their members. As the key site of MATA sociality moved from the streets of their barrios into the echo chambers of segregated gang prisons from the mid-2000s, the identity of MATA cliques and members came unmoored from their neighborhoods. The MATA opted out of the neighborhood's social and ethical world, becoming parasitic on and predatory within their neighborhoods as extortion transformed the gang's moral economy of violence. The time horizon of gang members has also been changing in potentially important ways. At the outset of my research here, gang members expected and mostly got very short careers. If you lived to be 23, you had the epithet el veterano, the veteran, added to your gang nickname. A gangster called El Abuelo, the grandfather, had been deposed as a national leader of the Barrio 18 before he was 30, and his spot was taken by a younger upstart called El Lobo, coincidentally the leader of the clique from the neighborhood I work in. Lobo is still there at the top more than a decade later, now balder, much fatter, and despite having been incarcerated the whole time, he now has a home address on his more recent court filings in one of the city's swankiest new condo developments, rather than this poor barrio of Zone 18. So a smash and grab, get what you can while the getting's good sort of mentality might make sense if you're a teenager thinking that you have a few good years to enjoy your career. But it's perhaps a less intuitive mindset if you're a middle-aged adult sentenced to, in El Lobo's case, 1,675 years so far, with more pending charges, and thinking about how to maximize your comfort, power, and profits long-term. How can you maintain your tax base, diversify your revenue streams, maximize your leverage both within and beyond your core territories? Another point I want to highlight is that while the MATA may have developed a general interest in retaining barrio residents and businesses, and abandoned houses are a much less common sight than they once were, displacement does persist within these gang territories. Detectives with the National Police Force's Extortion Unit told me of recent cases of people in Nuevo Mero selling 2- and 3-story cinder block homes for just 20,000 quetzales, about 2,000 euros, a small fraction of what they should be worth, in their desperation to get out of the gang's extortion zone. And importantly, displacement is now not just an effect or a symptom of criminal power occasioned by fear of violence associated with extortion, but it's also a strategy for the consolidation of that power. MATA violence targeting residents who default on or resist extortion, or who are suspected of collaborating with rivals or authorities, is still an anticipated eventuality. But it's now more likely to be expressed as intimidating displays designed to scare people out of the neighborhood, for instance, strafing the exteriors of their homes with gunfire, than the fatal and often spectacularly brutal executions of the early years of their extortion economy. This form of violence, and the most often intra-urban displacement that follows it, is less visible to and problematic for the Guatemalan state. With widespread resistance to extortion within their territories generally broken, intimidation designed to provoke displacement permits a smoother extraction of extortion rents than bombastic displays of widespread violence. And displacement also presents an opportunity to bump up extortion profits. In the San Martin de Porres market pictured here, located just across the Barranco from Romero Zone 18, when a stall closes up, which often happens because the holder finds themselves unable to pay both the municipality's charge of $20 to $400 and the MATA's fee of $13 to $40 each month, The gang collects not just the same quota from the succeeding owner of that stall, but also a startup down payment of 50,000 to 70,000 quetzales, or up to about 7,000 or 8,000 euros. The years of my fieldwork in El Romero have seen an evolving territorial project of gang rule in this barrio, which shares its trajectory with many other red zones in and beyond Guatemala City. The neighborhood has gone from a turf to be defended to a target of violence to a market to exploit. This arc of extortion has been accompanied by persistent shifting dynamics of displacement from the core territories of Guatemala's maras. First as a byproduct of the violence employed by the Mala towards establishing their territorial power and extortion economy, but latterly also as a strategy for maintaining and furthering that territorial extortion economy. And the physical dislocation of forced displacement has also been accompanied by a deep sense of social rupture and moral dislocation, although this has been lessening over time. One way we can perhaps understand the distress and disorientation, as well as the very elevated levels of brutal violence of the early years of extortion in this gang territory, is through the lens of a Marxian primitive accumulation. The first years of my fieldwork here coincided with a moment in time in which Guatemala City's gangs were extracting themselves from expectations of class solidarity and community reciprocity, establishing themselves as a new rentier class through extortion, dispossession, and appropriation. A subsequent research visit showed me the shock and bombastic violence of this phase dissipated over time, receding into the routinized exploitation of the Mara's current extortion economy, in which, as quotes from my informants on a previous slide suggest, gang members are the landlords, the owners, the empresarios, pure capitalists. So in conclusion, kind of trying to pull a few of these strands together, as I said at the outset, this is very much a kind of new effort to bring together strands of my research. And so I'm going to end on some questions that I hope to continue exploring perhaps this afternoon and over the next phase of my research. So thinking about the kind of more ethnographic dimensions, I'm very interested in the question of how people have come to reconcile and accommodate themselves over time to this deep sense of rupture that I heard about for several years, of social codes and solidarities, a redrawing of the webs of reciprocity in which their everyday lives are placed. But then starting to think about displacement as well, there's the question about what point does risk become intolerable? Why is it that extortion seems to be fueling more displacement than the peaks of violence we saw 15 years ago? What resources for refuge do people have when they do decide that it's too much, that it is intolerable? When do they leave? Where do they go and why? What are the different push and pull factors bringing people either to remote rural corners of Guatemala or pulling them towards international borders? And then finally starting to think more about these national dimensions, what measures or reforms could make Northern Triangle states into reliable sources of protection for residents of gang territories? Is there a way to do that without the radical trade-off between civil rights and security that we've seen in El Salvador? And then on the more international development, how can international protection regimes be made more responsive to criminal displacement as a cause of forced migration in Latin America and beyond? We've seen since the start of this century that a large majority of violent deaths worldwide are no longer happening in contexts of kind of formally declared armed violence. They're occasioned by criminal violence, interpersonal violence of the sort that fueled the very high murder rates of the Northern Triangle countries earlier this century. So how are we going to account for that in the international humanitarian regimes that seek to provide protection for human rights and human security? And I think another comparative point to potentially consider is how different forms of criminal economies generate potentially distinct drivers of displacement. So there's, I think, a complex nexus of criminality and displacement happening. The forms of displacement and the reasons for displacement that we see in an extortion economy are importantly distinct from those that we might see among a drug gang territory. In an extortion economy, as I've described through the ethnographic material, the gang's profit is extracted from the people living within that territory. It requires their victimization and their exploitation. In a drug or other commodity-based economy, they require the space and they require the collaboration, cooptation, or at least kind of resigned silence of the people within that territory. But they don't actually need to victimize and violate the people living within there in order to make their profits. And so I do think that we need more kind of attention on different patterns, different repertoires and logics of violence that arise in different kinds of criminal economies, and how that might interact with different forms of displacement. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kate. The floor is yours. Do you want to stay where you are, or do you want to come up?
Let's record.
Yeah. So
that you should be
yeah,
there.
so come on now.
Is it? I wonder if maybe I should go back to the start.
Also, that's what I'll do now.
Okay, Katherine, thanks a lot for this excellent talk. Very interesting. I received the slides of this presentation this morning. I didn't read the text, so I improvised a little bit now about the lecture. So what I find very interesting about your lecture and talk is that it is based on a longer term involvement in Guatemala, more than 10 years, maybe almost 20 years, and not 20 years, talking about my own experience. So you returned a couple of days, right? You returned from Guatemala and you stayed for a couple of months with your family. So a bit of fresh information in the presentation. My own experience is in El Salvador. I visited Guatemala a couple of times in the 80s, and for the past 10 years, I haven't been there. Their neighbors and the experiences with gangs in El Salvador and Guatemala are quite similar gang structures. But the most important difference is that since Bukele's election as president in El Salvador, gang power has diminished in the past 2 years when Bukele started with the exceptional measures. The gangs have been defeated, more or less. 80,000 gang members approximately were arrested. A mega prison was built. Bukele calls himself the coolest president in the world. And so when I listened to your talk, I think like once upon a time it was like this in El Salvador, and has really changed there. What I find interesting, just a few observations about the first part of your lecture, is that in the political talk about the country, the focus is really on corruption. So we have war against corruption. In El Salvador, it was until the recent presidential elections still the gangs that were betrayed as terrorists and had to be defeated, and that's not so much talk about corruption. Very interesting also the new to me, the overview of the international declarations and why it is so difficult to for asylum seekers in Guatemala and the Triangle to get asylum. And I was also surprised by the fact that the perceptions of insecurity rise, whereas the homicide rates are going down, and the levels of extortion going up. Is there a link? I'll get back to that. So very interesting story about the Colonia El Romero in the zone 18 of Guatemala City. And I liked it that you compared the situation in this neighborhood in the end, or in 2008 and after, when the barrio de Extortion gained control of the neighborhood, and more recent years. And when you describe the situation in the neighborhood in the years after 2008, it reminds me of my research in El Salvador between 2014 and 2019, when I talk about the jungle, Salvador. There's no security at all. They don't know how to go in. So You explained it very well. And then during a more recent visit, you found that there was less disorientation, new rules, more predictability. I think that's an important indicator of order, local order. Do people perceive that there's more predictability in place? And you link this to a new model of the gang or a transformation of the gang. Described so the local police seems to be better organized. The relationship with the prison gangs is better, it's more efficient also. And they diversify their portfolios. And then you also argue that displacement becomes a new possible strategy of the gang to go back to residents that don't want to pay, that don't want to pay. So very interesting slide where you say like from turf to target to market. I have a couple of, and then we say, well, this is a case of primitive accumulation towards maybe more advanced forms of accumulation of the gang in neighborhoods, more institutionalized. I have a couple of questions and remarks about this. So one question is, what happened to the gangs in Guatemala, and what do we know about the networks and the groups? We know from literature, not only in gangs, but also other local groups, criminal groups, that when they start to, when they become stationary, as Michael Olsen says, they start to develop ways to relate to the population, maybe also to build government structures. Charles Tilly writes about it. And then Enrique Arias, in his book on criminal enterprises in America, says like relationship with governments, with politicians, but also government officials is very important. So one of the claims he makes, I think, is that the more collusion there is, the more stable relationships between criminal actors or government officials, the greater the chances that it will be safer, more secure, that people will experience more order, more predictability. And I wondered if you can say anything about the relations between the elites in this barrio and government officials, and maybe also other social groups, like local community organizations. You also mentioned the link between professionalization and decreasing homicide rates. And I wondered, is this really the case? Because if it is that, do we have any data on this? Because maybe the decreasing homicide rates are the result of the fact that gangs no longer want to fight each other. Sort of, they agree on the status quo, who controls what territory. It's inefficient to fight each other, so you have to cooperate, and there's less inter-gang violence. It's something that was said in Salvador, and there's still high levels of violence towards residents. And maybe if the violence has diminished for the lethal violence, maybe it's still, I mean, I hear you talk about rapes, about the family that was murdered maybe not such a long time ago. So maybe it's still different. I also wondered if people really experience more stability, predictability, and how do we know? And the figure that you presented in the beginning of your talk about the perception of security in Guatemala, that people experience higher levels of insecurity. That's not necessarily the result, of course, of the situation they experience on the ground. It can also be the result of government discourse or generalized discourse on security. I'm interested to hear what you think. And lastly, can you tell us what should be done? I was in Salvador. I was in Salvador a couple of months ago, first in Colombia and then Salvador. And everybody that I met on the road from Mexico and Colombia said, "You go to El Salvador? Okay, he's a hero." Right? So, and I, in Guatemala, politicians also use the idea that you should do the Bukele thing. Colombia has the effort of done. Salvador, but also Guatemala's have experience with negotiations or dialogues with gangs. What do you think? What's more? soon.